Our gospel lesson is from Mark's Gospel, chapter 9, beginning with verse 30. They went on from there and passed through Galilee. Jesus did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him. And 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a little child, and putting it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Greatness is a topic I think that we talk about a lot, whether we realize it or not. Think about how many times we use this word great to describe something. Sometimes we say, "That was a great meal." And we mean we're full, we're satisfied, we're just content with the company, with the whole setting, the whole experience. It was a great meal, we say sometimes. Or we might say, "That was a great book." And we probably mean we didn't want the book to end. It was so good, we were just so completely absorbed in it. Sometimes we say, "That was a great movie." And we mean we were just sitting on the edge of our seats the whole time. What was the last thing, I wonder if you can remember, what was the last thing you described as great? I like to listen on Monday morning to sports radios. It's so entertaining to hear the host talk about all the games that took place on Saturday and Sunday. And of course, what they inevitably do right away, they start talking about which were great games and which players were great. And if you listen long enough, I guarantee on almost every day, sooner or later, the question will come up, who's the GOAT? Who's the greatest of all time? And when that comes up, it just generates all kinds of vigorous debate and passionate feelings. It's almost like you know they're going in that direction. They're going to end up there sooner or later in the episode. And I kind of, as I was thinking about it, think that's a fairly recent phenomenon, how frequently commentators in all kinds of areas will talk about who was the greatest of all time. I think it used to be that you would be very, very reticent to talk about someone else being the greatest. Maybe there were one or two players in all of history who might warrant that kind of talk about, in this case, sports greatness. But nowadays, when you listen to them, before you know it, there are 10 different players they're arguing about. 10 to 15 different players are in the conversation for who's the greatest, who's the GOAT. Over the weekend, Shohei Ohtani, a Japanese baseball player who plays for the Los Angeles Dodgers, got 6 hits in one game. 3 of those hits were home runs, and he also stole 2 bases. He has more home runs and more stolen bases in this season than anybody else in all of baseball history. And so you know what they've been talking about all weekend long? He's the greatest, isn't he? Doesn't this now? And wasn't that the greatest game that anyone ever had in baseball? Maybe we've witnessed kind of a greatness inflation over the last many years. It's almost like we can't help ourselves. We just desire to talk about something being great. We're driven to talk about something being great. Now, we may not be exactly sure what the measure of greatness is, but it's just enthralling, satisfying to say, "That's great." So maybe we have Tony the Tiger to thank for that, right? If you remember Tony the Tiger, maybe he's the one started it all. It was just an advertising ploy. Frosted Flakes, they're great, Tony the Tiger would say. But imagine if the subject of greatness is yourself. Instead of saying, they're great, you just walk around saying, I'm great. And not just the great, you walk around saying, I'm the greatest. I suspect that would make you feel pretty uncomfortable. I don't know about you, but I think I was sort of raised to believe that self-aggrandizement was a sure sign that you really didn't have much to boast about at all. If you have to walk around saying you're great all the time, you're probably not very great after all. But apparently for the disciples of all people, it's a different story. They spend their time walking along the way with Jesus, arguing about who's the greatest. And it's really just an absurd conversation in some ways. It's an absurd conversation because of the context that they find themselves in. It's not absurd to be talking about it, apparently, amongst the disciples, because this would have been a fairly common thing in the society of their own day. Status was important. They would have been arguing about it. We have texts that demonstrate rabbis argue about whose piety is the greatest. But here in this context, in light of what's going on, arguing about who's the greatest just seems to be ridiculous. Peter and James and John, they've recently witnessed Jesus be transfigured up on a high mountain there in the presence of Moses and Elijah. So maybe that sight, I don't know, maybe that fueled their imaginations. Jesus talking with Moses and Elijah is enough to make you wonder, who's the greatest prophet of all time? Maybe they said to each other, is Moses the goat, Elijah the goat? I don't know. Is Jesus the goat? They just seem to be compelled to talk about this. But on the way coming down the mountain, Jesus says, don't tell anybody about this. Don't tell anybody about what you've seen until after I rise again from the dead. When they walk then up to the rest of the disciples, they find that those disciples are arguing with religious leaders about why they couldn't heal a man's son, a boy who was possessed by a spirit that just physically tormented him. And Jesus walks up and says again, what are you arguing about? And the man says, I brought my son to your disciples, but they couldn't heal him. They couldn't. And then a crowd quickly gathers around, making the scene even larger. And Jesus is frustrated that the disciples couldn't heal the boy. He takes it as a sign of a lack of the disciples' faith. And then he proceeds to drive the spirit out of the boy. But they immediately leave that scene and start to walk throughout Galilee. And again, just like as he was coming down the mountains trying to tell the disciples, don't talk about this, as he's walking through Galilee, he's trying to keep a low profile. Clearly at this point, he's headed toward Jerusalem. He's already told the disciples once that he's going to suffer many things. He's going to be rejected by the religious leaders, be crucified, and after 3 days, rise again. And now, passing along through Galilee on the way to Jerusalem, Jesus seems to be persistently trying to get this into the disciples' heads, teaching them about this, but at the same time, helping them perhaps to understand it without getting wrapped up in all of the crowds and all of the things going on. I'm going to be handed over, Jesus says. They will kill me, and after 3 days, I will rise again. Jesus was walking through the area, Mark tells us, but he didn't want anybody to know it. And still with this intentionality on the part of Jesus toward his disciples, trying to help them along, trying to help them to understand, it says the disciples don't understand what he means, and they're afraid to ask him about it. Why is that? Why are they having such a hard time understanding? Are their minds focused on other things than what Jesus is saying? Are they still sort of caught up both in what happened on the Mount of Transfiguration and what they may be perceiving in the crowds at large? Are they still caught up in imagining about the glory that may come to them? Do they have more and more aspirations of looking forward toward a triumph that at some point is going to exalt them? They came to Capernaum, to Peter and Andrew's hometown, the scene of Jesus' early ministry that had gathered so many people in amazement and wonder that had caused his fame to spread. And even there, again, Jesus pulls the disciples away into a house, into a smaller setting, away from the noise, away from the excitement, away from the expectation of the crowds, into this place where Jesus has the disciples' sole attention. I wonder if this isn't a moment, a setting where Jesus can teach the disciples now and they can learn what is the very heart of what Jesus wants them to understand about who he is and what he's calling them to. I imagine this scene and this setting there in the house now with the disciples gathered around him is kind of like a higher level graduate seminar with just the most advanced students, or those who are supposed to be advanced, sitting around the professor in a very intimate learning setting where they're growing in their understanding, where they're sharing in perspective, where there's this kind of revealing of who the teacher is and what the teacher thinks. That's the kind of setting that we have here in the house with the disciples gathered around Jesus. Well, Jesus begins the seminar by focusing, at least as he sees it, on what is clearly upmost in the disciples' minds. What were you arguing about on the way, on the road, he says. No one wants to answer because, as Jesus surely knew when he asked the question, which may be the case in many seminars, they were arguing about who was the greatest. It isn't that the disciples are being egotistical or self-centered, is it? They're simply reflecting this emphasis on status that characterized all society. They just seem to be imbued with the other forces that are going on in their lives as they mingle with the crowds, as they try and make their way in the world. Even as Jesus' disciples, they seem to be oriented towards, let's be successful, let's be important, let's achieve at all costs, let's dominate everyone else, let's make sure we get ourselves into a position where we can control what happens. Let's make sure we're the greatest compared to others. Who doesn't want to be the greatest? Jesus asked this question, what were you arguing about on the way? And they don't answer. It doesn't say that they were embarrassed. It just says they don't answer because they had been arguing about who was the greatest. Apparently, something within them says, we can't tell Jesus about this. But surely they must have felt and realized that Jesus knew the answer. What were you arguing about on the way? Then Mark tells us Jesus sits down. Another sign of instruction. The seminar is going to become even closer, more intimate, more intense. Jesus says, what were you arguing about along the way? As though he's inviting them to begin to open up their own minds to who they are and what it is, in fact, they may be misunderstanding. This seems to be the point, I think, where Jesus is getting ready to say to them, and the point at which they'll be able to hear, you've got this all wrong. It's not easy to hear that, is it? You've got this all wrong. Actually, most of the time, we probably can't hear it. We can't accept it when we do hear it. But there are moments in life when we do hear it, when we can't accept it, and then be open to real transformation. There are moments in life when we need to hear and see and understand how we are wrong so we can reorient ourselves so that we can be transformed and ushered into a new way forward. Last year, before our granddaughter Sydney's birthday, Helen started to work on a birthday gift for Sydney, and she decided she would get Sydney a wooden wardrobe that she could order online, a cute little wooden wardrobe that was decorated with all of Walt Disney's princesses. And this would go in Sydney's bedroom, and she could hang up her own princess costumes there and all the other play clothes that Helen had in store to give to her. So she ordered it online, and it came in a big box, and we put it in our car, and we headed to Tampa. And did I say it came in a big box disassembled? And then on Sydney's birthday, Helen said, "Your job is to assemble the wardrobe. You can put it together in the garage while I'll be out running some errands for the birthday party and playing with Sydney. It'll be a surprise to her, and she won't see it till you've put it all together." Great, I can do that. And so I started to work on it. I opened the box and found all the 70 wooden pieces and the 20-page booklet of instructions and that one little tire thing that they give you to screw them all together. And I diligently followed the instructions step by step. Each piece had a little sticker and number on it. And after about an hour and a half, I was actually about halfway through, I think on page 10 or so, when many of the smaller pieces were now suddenly ready to be put together, and it would actually start to look like a wardrobe. But it became very apparent that the pieces were not going to fit together correctly. So I went back and I checked every sticker, I checked every number, I started to work my way back through the instructions. Nothing would fit. And any illusions that I had that I was the world's greatest grandfather were quickly evaporating. Periodically, Helen would come out into the garage and say, "How's it going? Why doesn't it look like a wardrobe yet? Can I look at the instructions?" No, I followed the instructions exactly. I was frustrated and angry and desperate, and at some point I just broke so that I couldn't even protest when Helen started to look at the pieces a little more closely, and she said, "You know, I think you've got this wrong. I think this piece here is just backwards." And in disbelief, ready to prove her wrong, I went back and checked the instructions, and sure enough, that was it. There was one piece that I just had completely oriented in the wrong direction. And once I flipped that, everything came together, and this wonderful wardrobe suddenly appeared in the garage. And I was relieved, I was chagrined, and I was surprised at how delighted I was now that this wardrobe was finished. I don't really think I felt great. I just felt whole in some way. You've got it all wrong. Sometimes hearing that and seeing that and believing that can become a moment of transformation and reorientation for us. What were you arguing about on the way? Jesus asked his disciples. No one said anything because they had been arguing about who was the greatest. And then that becomes a moment, a point when Jesus says, "You've got it all wrong." Now, in fact, Jesus' teachings, his demonstration, his very life can become again for the disciples a mean of transformation, a way forward in their lives, the way to follow him as he's called them. This becomes now a moment when these disciples are in fact called again to follow Jesus in his way. Think about the times when Jesus has had to say to the church and to his disciples in the world, "You've got it all wrong," and then give them the opportunity to be transformed by his life. When the church, when Jesus' disciples justified the segregation of people on the basis of race, when the church treated some people as though they were less than because of their race or their ethnic origin, didn't the church at some point hear Jesus say, "You've got this all wrong"? When Jesus' disciples excluded people from leadership and full participation in Christ's body because of gender or sexual orientation, how long did it take the church before it heard Jesus say, "You've got this all wrong"? Where might Jesus be saying to the church today, "You've got this all wrong"? What have we been arguing about on the road that we aren't really willing to tell Jesus? Perhaps it is that the church is often a reflection of the division and conflict and partisanship that drives and animates culture wars, instead of an alternative embodiment of Jesus' life that unites and heals and reconciles. No one said anything because they had been arguing on the road about who was the greatest. Maybe sometimes the church just becomes enamored with climbing and striving forward toward a notion of greatness characteristic of society, and preoccupied with measuring up to society's ideas about what's successful and what's important. What do we think it means to be a great church? And what would happen if we heard Jesus say, "Well, you've got this all wrong"? To begin with, whoever wants to be first of all must be last of all and servant of all. Discipleship has to correspond to Christology, one commentator reminds us. We are going to be called again and again and again by Jesus to follow in his way. We are not to be striving and driving after the same things everyone else in society is grasping for. Our way of following Christ is going to be different. We may spend all of our time arguing about who should go up on Mount Rushmore. Those 4 presidents or somebody else? Who should go up on the Mount Rushmore of the church? Those 4 pastors, those 4 elders, those 4 leaders, or somebody else? And Jesus says, the question is, are you going to follow me to the cross? Who's going up on the cross? I remember a story my brother John told about his oldest daughter, Beth, when she was just going into elementary school. I think it was first grade, maybe it was kindergarten, but John, being still a new parent, was delighted in everything that she did. And she came home from school one day and told her parents, "I get to be the classroom leader next week." And so John said, "Great. I'm going to go to school with my new video camera, and I'm going to get the video, Beth being the classroom leader. I'll get there on Monday, and it'll be a surprise to her, and she won't even know it." And so he dutifully got all of his video equipment together the next Monday, went to school to video Beth being the classroom leader. And he positioned himself in an outdoor hallway so he could see the class line as it came by, expecting that she would be in the front leading the way. And he was filming, and children came by, and children came by, and children came by. And he was frustrated because Beth wasn't there. And so he put his camera down, and right when he put his camera down, here came Beth at the end of the line pushing a little classmate in her wheelchair. And John missed it. And John missed it. And when they got home, Beth said, "Dad, did you get me on video?" And he said, "No, I thought you would be at the front of the line." And she said, "Dad, don't you understand? To be the leader means we get to help. We get to help everyone in class that needs help." To begin with, whoever would be first of all must be last of all, Jesus said. And then he took a child, put it in their midst, put it in the congregation, and said, "Anyone who welcomes this child welcomes me, and anyone who welcomes me welcomes the Father who sent me." That word welcome in Greek is very interesting. We can think of it as receiving. We can think of it as hospitality. But very literally, in many cases, it has this meaning of take by the hand. It's as though Jesus is saying, anyone who would like to be the leader can take by the hand the weakest, the most vulnerable, the most insignificant in your midst, and welcome me. Receive me. And the Father who sent me. I happened to see what is unarguably one of the greatest shows on TV recently as I was scrolling through YouTube, The Andy Griffith Show. And it wasn't an actual show, it was the Andy Griffith reunion show. When Andy Griffith was meeting now 30 years later or so with the various actors in the series talking about the show originally. And at the beginning, Andy Griffith and Ronnie Howard sit down and they're talking about the show and reminiscing and talking about how wonderful it was and how meaningful it was. And they begin to talk about one of the first episodes. And Andy says to Ron Howard, Ron, you know what was so important is that all the characters on that show had to be honest. And your character, Opie, was perhaps the most honest throughout every episode. And that's probably because you were just a little child, only 6 years old when you started. And they remembered the first episode of the whole series. Opie and his dad, Andy Taylor, were in Opie's bedroom because Opie had decided he wanted to run away. And so he laid down in the bed with his dad and he said, Dad, I want to run away. And Andy said, well, okay, well, let's think about this. Let's think through this. And Andy said, you probably shouldn't have told me. And Opie said, well, Dad, you told me to tell you everything that I wanted to do. And Andy said, well, no, this is a little bit different. If you're going to run away, you have to write a letter. I do, I have to write a letter. And Opie said, I don't know how to write because Ronnie Howard didn't know how to write at that time. So Andy got up and sat down at a little desk and started to write a letter for Opie. Dear Pa, he said, I'm going to run away, and I'm never going to see you again. And all of a sudden, Opie said, what? Why are you writing that? And Andy looked up and said, well, you run away, you're never going to see me. And Opie said, I don't want to do that. And Andy said, well, if you run away, you'll never see me again. And before you knew it, Opie had reached up, grabbed the letter, torn it up, thrown it to the side, and jumped into Andy's arms and said, Pa, I don't want to run away. I don't want to run. I don't want to never get to see you again. And Andy said, well, I guess it's the boy's right to change his mind. Now, I don't know why, but I was bawling while I'm watching that episode. And I'm trying to figure out, what is it? What happened there? And it made me wonder, sometimes God gives us the grace of seeing that we are wrong, so that we can again hear Christ call and jump into his arms and find the true way ahead. Amen.